imagination. Imagine that you are transported across the Atlantic 160 years ago to the 1860s into New England, into America, and the states that exist there. And sadly, a conflict has brewed, and as a result of this conflict, it is a vicious civil war has begun. And this is a terrible conflict. Civil war is the worst. Neighbour fighting neighbour, father fighting son, brother versus brother. And indeed, if you look very closely at the forces in front of you today, you will see some identical looking brothers. Indeed, my own son is in the ranks of the Confederacy today. Now then, this is a terrible conflict, ladies and gentlemen, because 4% of the American people who took part, 4% of the American population died in this conflict. 650,000. And that's equivalent to the loss of life in Europe during the First World War. Now, what I'm going to do is explain to you who you're looking at. So those forces moving forward in a mixture of blue and grey and brown, those are the Confederacy, those are the soldiers from various regiments of the Confederacy, mostly from the southern United States. And they were fighting for their independence, were seceding from the Union of the United States. There were 11 states that broke away, states like Virginia, Texas, South Carolina, Georgia, Louisiana, and so forth. Those troops that you see further down the slope, wearing blue and green, those are troops called the Union, often referred to as the Federals. They were fighting to preserve the Union. At the start of the war, ladies and gentlemen, despite the population of the state just being over 20 million, their army was tiny, only about 10,000 men, and they were armed with weapons that were not that dissimilar to what their grandfathers and great-grandfathers had used in the Napoleonic Wars or indeed in the Revolutionary Wars. They were armed with smoothbore muskets. Those who watched Sharp and Waterloo, even that terrible film Napoleon recently, will be familiar with what those smoothbore muskets were. Slow firing, and use the flint to be able to prime the pan and fire that. It took over 20 seconds to load. They were very inaccurate, nothing more than 80 yards, and they were very susceptible to weather conditions with powder that would go down and you couldn't fire it when it was raining. So at the start of the war, ladies and gentlemen, most of the American army were armed with Springfield 42, or they were armed with smoothbore muskets. These Springfield 42s were no more accurate than about 100 yards, 150 yards. That's pretty much the length of this arena. But they're also armed with something at the end of their musket called a percussion cap. Very similar to those of you who've ever had toy guns as kids. Those could make them an all-weather firing weapon. Now then, that would enable them to fire when it was raining, and it also enabled them to have more accuracy as well, because the charge that was being fired was more powerful. The muskets that they were using now were no longer smoothbore, they were rifles, so they could fire at longer range. They were able to triple their range to over 300 yards, and that is the same distance you can just make out somebody's head. So at 300 yards, just to try and gauge what 300 yards would be from where I'm standing, there's a crane over in that distance, just below the sun. That's probably about 300 yards over there. That would be what most of these soldiers trained would be hoping to be able to hit a target at, so tripling the range. For these men and women as well, ladies and gentlemen, there were a lot of women in the ranks in the American Civil War. Estimates somewhere between 500 and 1,000 women actually joined the ranks and fought in the major battles of the American Civil War. These men were largely untrained. They were carpenters, they were mostly farmers, 80% of them were farmers, and so they had to learn on the job really quickly. 90% of their time was spent learning parade ground maneuvers, and that is exactly what you're watching. That is what these guys are doing today. They are practicing how to move on the battlefield. And just as much as they're practicing how to move, these NCOs, the ones with stripes on their arms, and the officers commanding them, they are learning their trade as well to give the correct commands to make sure that the soldiers follow their orders. Moving troops moved in columns, usually columns of 4, if the numbers allowed it, or columns of 2, and then when they wanted to attack, they would change from column into line. And over the last minute or two, you've seen that, ladies and gentlemen. Now, I just want to give a big shout out, not only to the soldiers, but also I want to hopefully get some of the children and their parents who want to take part in the drill after these guys have finished firing, make their way to the top where the tannoy, the blue van is, in about 5-10 minutes, and we'll have some kids drill. So an opportunity for the kids to get involved in that, and I can promise you it will be a lot of fun. So please, if you're interested in that, do take part in that. Now then, as I say, they do practice an awful lot of moving around, an awful lot of positioning, and why? Because battles we usually want by which side to get the greatest weight of shot, effectively of ammunition poured into the enemy at a close enough range. So if you practice those maneuvers well enough, you could be able to destroy more of the enemy than they destroyed of you. And obviously, as you can tell from the way that wars are fought even nowadays, battles generally favour the defenders if they were able to get a good position behind cover, stone walls, ravines, those sorts of things, even fences. So trying to use natural cover was often a good advantage. Now then, the southern states tried to seek their independence, so the northern states, the federal government tried to take back those states, so they invariably invaded those southern states. This gave the southern states the opportunity to often choose the ground that they fought on. So it's no surprise that the southern forces lost less casualties than the northern ones. At the start of the war, because the rifles were quite inaccurate and the tactics similarly quite antiquated, there was still a belief that the bayonet was the main weapon on the battlefield to use. So these soldiers would learn bayonet drill. They would learn to charge with the bayonet, what you see the Confederates just displayed there. And those bayonets, ladies and gentlemen, are vicious long knives. They're triangular shape, and that would enable that bayonet to go into the body. It would have a groove so that it wouldn't actually get stuck in the body. And yes, once the victim went down, you would extract it, you would invariably have to stick your foot on their chest and pull it out. Grim business indeed. So, soldiers learning their craft takes weeks and weeks, but of course there is no substitute for experience, and most of these young men would invariably gain that experience by being bloodied on the battlefield. And the casualties in these early battles were horrendous. Just to give you an idea, one of the worst casualties for any battle in the American Civil War fought in the Second War in 1862 at Antietam, had in an estimate around about 40,000 killed or wounded. If you were wounded, ladies and gentlemen, the likelihood is you would probably succumb to infection and die. Casualties invariably did. They didn't die in the first hour from loss of blood. They probably would die from infection. I'm afraid medical knowledge was, as was often referred to, this was the medieval Middle Age, the medieval medical knowledge for this period. Despite them knowing about the value of antiseptics, it was very rarely used. And there was insufficient chloroform to be able to help those who needed their limbs amputated. Because the rate of the fire rate of these bullets, when they hit the body, was quite slow,